So, and now let's continue with some general IGA improvements. That means identity governance improvements. And we start with risk calculation. There was as well a big performance improvements. You might remember that calculating risk sometimes was a little bit painful, especially because of some blockings between objects. And that was then leading to two facts. One of them was a very long-term schedule. And the second thing was that an immediate risk calculation button was implemented to help with specific single objects. However, what happened is in Identity Measure 9.3 is that a new table, QER Risk Index Column Dependent, was created. And this table is now a new way to store dependencies between risk calculations and risk objects, with the result that the complete process to calculate risks is enormously speeded up and it's not running into blockings any longer. The old table, QER Risk Index as source table, was removed by the other new table. At the end, beside of the speed improvement, that affects two other things. First of all, the column QER Risk Index is execute immediately is of course removed as well, and that is because that manually risk calculation thing was removed. It is not necessary any longer because the scheduled risk calculation is now fast enough and available. And secondly, this schedule I was talking about was set to run all 3 hours, which is much faster than before. If you want to reconfigure it, for example, in demo environments, please do it. It is like with all the schedules, you can just configure it, but ensure that you find, I like to say, making sense configuration. A risk calculation all 3 hours in a production environment makes sense. Yeah, a risk calculation all 3 minutes in a demo environment might make sense. The same configuration in a production environment makes no sense, of course. Secondly, and we continue with risk calculation, all of these risk-related columns was made visible much better than before. You see now influencing and affecting columns in a standard tree view. If we just zoom a little bit into the picture, you can see that here you see for a very specific column, you just select all the influencers and you see as well the effects that on that very specific column exists. And that is, of course, for the following columns. The whole thing is now much more visible and it is easier to analyze. Another improvement is just related to manage the team membership responsibilities. The always question in each organization is who has left and who is just new and what's to do with responsibilities in my team. Several people have which are leaving or which are just new in the team. And for that, there is now a new form built. This is the management of the responsibilities. You can see it on the right side of the screen. They help at the end to determine ownerships and manage ownerships, and they are there to ensure that orphan ownerships, if exists, can get then new people assigned. Let's have a look at that in a small video. You see how that thing here works. Therefore, people are just selecting specific people and then they can just configure specific responsibilities typically in M2N, depending on what at the end is necessary. And you have different views, as you easily can see, and you can remove people. Another very nice feature in Global IGA is to display now memberships which are ineffective. What is behind that? Typically, during the assignment of permissions and privileges, it is possible to get privileges assigned which are not effective from the beginning. A typical example is you are part of a role. That role does have permissions in an LDAP system, but because you have no LDAP account yet, these permissions are just potential. They are ineffective, because without the account, you will never get these permissions assigned. However, However, there are many other use cases as well where by indirect assignment it is possible to run in situations where permissions are not effective. This deactivation of accounts, whatever else, the permissions are not effective. In the old standard web, it was often the case that only the effective permissions was displayed, but the ineffective permissions was not displayed at the end. And customers say, yeah, that's not really the truth, because if I look into the target system or if I look into the identity manager with the admin front ends, I can see there are permissions assigned even if they don't have effect currently on the situation of a specific identity. However, now in the new standard web portal, as you easily can see, all permissions are displayed and ineffective permissions are flagged with a specific blue flag, as you see it here in the screenshot. And with that, you can then easily see, yes, this permission is assigned, but currently it is not active for that specific identity. The timeline view was just improved in a way of that you can now find two more things. First, some very nice icons you can easily see. Looking into the timeline on the right-hand side, there are now pluses and minuses and pen icons, which just ensure that you easily can see that something was edited, deleted, or modified. This should help you now to understand the timeline a little bit easier than before. Additionally to that, there are filters implemented, and these filters can now exactly highlight these different modifications. That means you can filter, for example, for changed objects. Last but not least, the daytime control was improved. It is now showing, as we easily can see, the monthly information in case of a written text. This is very helpful, especially in a business where you are crossing time zones, because as we all know, there are different time and date formats available. And if the month is just written in text, that's easier to identify than another number. From a key performance indicator perspective, there are some improvements as well. First of all, there are some new KPIs for target systems and target system types implemented. KPIs for logged user accounts of enabled identities, groups without users, assignments, and entitlements without requests. All stuff that should help managing people to easily identify problems. Additionally to that, the KPIs can now be grouped in a hierarchical structure. You can see that on the left-hand side of the screenshot, and that should then as well help people to find the right KPIs. In a world where KPIs gets more and more important, that means the number of KPIs increases. This is a good scenario. Extended attributes and the support of them. Extended attributes are attributes you can assign to specific permissions, for example, to groups. However, what is that? The extended attribute, of course, exists since a while. The only thing that was modified is that these extended attributes can now be managed by target system administrators. And this means especially by role-based target system administrators. These can now manage permission groups. Additionally, permissions for insert, delete, and of course update was inserted. And in the same way that happened, we removed edit, insert, and delete permissions from the role-based permission group. So target system administrators can now manage that, but role-based permitted people using the base permission, namespace admin-based permissions, only can't. That might be a breaking change. Here you have to have a look into your processes. This makes the whole thing a little bit more granular than it was before, but also much more improved from my perspective. Extended attributes could now as well be maintained directly from the manager front end in the base configuration data if interests. Last feature on the extended attribute slide 1, of course, that we now support for Microsoft Entra ID scoped role assignments and as well for Microsoft Entra ID scope role eligibility. And I think the main important thing is that even the standard web portal now shows extended attributes wherever they are assigned. You can directly see them. Screenshots on the right-hand side are just documenting that. And with making them available everywhere, it was also necessary to ensure that extended attributes, where it makes sense, are now as well translatable. That means you can now configure different wordings or different text depending on the region into this. Another very interesting feature is the reapply of templates during reactivation of identities. What's behind that? The identity manager is using value templates, as we all know, and these value templates allow to configure or to create data out of other given data. Typical example, the internal name of a person object, it's built out of its first and last name and maybe name add-ons. However, this happens typically during creation of an object, and if configured in that way, override flag, then every time referenced values are getting modified. That means last name changes, internal name gets recalculated. And that with the override flag always, and without the override flag only initially. However, this was in the past not touched if an account was reactivated after activation. That means the status of the reactivated account was exactly the same than before the deactivation happened. There are now business scenarios outside where people say, this is what I like to see. In the same way, then there are customers outside telling us, if I reactivate somebody who was deactivated before, then it makes sense to double check all of these values based on templates to ensure that everything is compliant and correct and depending the rules. Because of duality of both, we have now a configuration parameter available, QR person, user, delete options, reapply templates on restore. And you can configure that feature. That means globally for all reactivated and former deactivated object types, templates will be calculated or they will not be calculated. Because that template recall is managed by the scripts vi_account recall, this was modified and it is also configured as an overridable script. If you want to see something different, you can easily override that script with your custom code. In the shopping cart, it is now possible just to enter your own request validation. There are some request validations which are standard, that was the past. And now in Identity 9.3, you can as well add such a validation into your web portal by just creating a composite API plugin. To ease that development of such a plugin, you can have a look into the API SDK and you will find there an implementation sample. Now let's talk about some attestation enhancements, of course. And the first thing here is random sample support. What's meant there? You can just define attestation campaigns, and part of the attestation campaign is, of course, the attestation policy. And the attestation policy determines what's to check, of course, and for which group of people to check. That could be easily a pain, especially in a big enterprise. For example, you have company-wide a specific policy. You want to ensure that people are following the policy, but to check every employee in your company would be painful, especially if we think about hundreds of thousands of people. However, for that type of attestation exists the so-named sample. That means you determine a specific sample of people, and for that very specific sample then the attestation happen. However, new in the Identity 9.3 is that these samples can now automatically picked based on a specific condition. You can see that on the right-hand side. The first screenshot there shows you a specific selectable condition that says this is the subset of people. And because such a subset could sometimes a little bit bigger. We talked about that, for example, all employees. It is possible in a second parameter, which is the sample size, between 0 and 100% to determine how big the sample should be. So, for example, 10% of the group determined by the condition. That is now configurable as well in the web portal, and with that you can easily create such random sets. We do have recommendations for attestation cases or for requests. However, since Identity Manager 9.3, these recommendations are not only to see in the standard web portal, now they are as well part of the adaptive cards. That means if you have an approval per Teams, so that is the support for approval anywhere, then beside the decision to make, you can as well see the recommendations. Again, in case of attestation, we know there are 3 different phases of attestation. There's the staging phase, where the attestation gets built. There is the attestation itself of a specific situation. And at the end, there is the challenge phase, where we talk about how to solve problems. However, for that challenge phase, there's a complete new UX experience developed in Identity Manager Web Portal 9.3. You can see that here on the right-hand side, much easier to see, much better to use with recommendations, everything in a new GUI that allows easily to handle these challenges. It is also possible to create challenge messages and to store them for specific attestation objects in UI core challenge text, as you easily can see it in the new column. Additionally to that, these challenge messages gets then displayed and help the decision makers to make the right decision. And now let's talk about approval decision rules. First, how to comment these decision rules. Our customer told us that the PVO decision rule description field, that means the description on a decision rule, is not long enough. That means you can only add a limited number of characters into that field before the field tells you it is now completely filled. This is especially a pain for customers who like to document on the rule level everything they do. That means write big essays into a description field. To solve that scenario, we just created a new property which is called PVO Decision Rule Remarks. That means there is now a remark field on a decision rule, which is a blob field, and you can enter as much text as you like to. To differ one with the other, the description field, that means the old field was renamed, it is now named short description. Secondly, if you create an attestation, you typically want to configure a decision rule. To do so, you drop down your dropdown, and in the dropdown there is now a list of PVO decision rules. This list typically is ordered like the developers ordered the list. And it could be that in some companies, the very important parts are more at the end of the lists, in difference to other companies where the important parts are more at the top of the list. To solve that scenario and give end users the ability to find faster what they need, it is now possible to change the sort order of that drop-down list. To do so, in Designer you can assign in a field called PVO Decision Rule Sort Order a number. And that number is then reflected in the list. So 1 comes for 2. That means if you just assign values from 1 to n to your list items, in that order the list will be displayed. There is one exception, and this is a value smaller than 0. In this case, this item will be hidden. That means it will be not displayed in the selection. So that scenario does support 2 things. On the one hand side, it configures the sort order of your decision rule selection list. And secondly, it allows you to disable decision rules you don't want to see in that dropdown. And now let's talk about IT shop enhancements, starting with a very common scenario. In the very past of the Identity Manager, it was possible in the portal to request something that was getting approved somewhere, and the end message you saw in the system was, "It is approved." Being approved was not a proof of that something was provisioned, because in an asynchronous working system like the Identity Manager is, that provisioning could happen later. For example, if there is a big data mass operation or something else, such provisioning of an approved item or permission could happen 5 minutes, 10 minutes later or something like that, depending on what the system is doing in the system load. However, that was a problem in the past, especially because if you want to react on such things in PVO as a person wants org table. And because of that, in Identity Manager 9.3, our developers decided now to completely remodel that whole thing in a way of that there are now new UI order state messages, so that if you request something and it gets approved, it will then be granted. And additionally to grant it, there will then be provisioning pending for it is on the way to get provisioned. And at the end, the status provisioned, which will let you know that the provisioning happened. Same thing for getting rid of. Therefore, there is an unsubscribing, which is at the end the granted for to delete items. And then we have deprovisioning pending. And once that happened, the status is deprovisioned. With the help of that, it is now possible easily in each front end to follow these different status messages, and you know exactly from which point in time something really happened. Regarding to the IT shop, there are some more experiences improved. First of all, as you easily can see, we have now a global shopping cart icon back in the user front end, so that from everywhere you can directly click on shopping cart and see what is part of your shopping cart. Secondly, of course, the complete front end was improved in case of performance. That means Identity Manager 9.3 portal should be react much faster. And last but not least, there is now more space available for data display, so that this is now another improvement you can use for your choice elements. And there is now a new advanced filter option available. And this filter option allows you, if you just enter a specific entitlement, to find capabilities to assign that entitlement to you. That means it identifies elements where that entitlement is handled you are searching for, and with that you can make a better decision how to assign that. For example, role-based indifferent to a direct entitlement permission. Therefore, you have to identify the role element, and that is what the filter can help you. If you order specific permissions in the Identity Manager, it is possible that this specific entitlement you are requesting for will just directly go into conflict with an existing role and will show up an inherited rule violation. So that means the role is defining something different, like you manually assign. However, these type of violations are now shown in the front end so that you can get aware of. Very new here in the front end is as well the chance to see in the request history, especially items which are created or in relation to delegations user made. In the past, they are part of the history. Now there's a filter available that filters that out so that you can see just objects or just entries depending on delegations. And you can filter on the one hand side my delegations. That means what happens to my objects or my delegations I made. And you can as well filter additionally what happens on delegations regarding to my identities I'm responsible for, or to my direct reports. In case of the IT shop, there is as well a new approval procedure available, and that approval procedure allows to determine a specific identity that should approve something. And that specific identity, and that's the important part, is determined in the request itself. That means I, as a requester, can determine the person to approve. We can now discuss if that makes sense or not. There are customers outside and enterprises where that scenario makes sense, and because of that it was created. What happens there is that you need to determine a request parameter for that specific request item, and that request item needs to store a person.uid person. That means the UID of a specific person, and on the selection of that, then a specific identity is determined, which is then the approver on PX. We saw that for attestation, even for IT shop requests and approvals. There is now the adaptive cards enhanced with showing the recommendations. The next feature is just a feature in the IT shop we all know from Amazon. Just show that very specific item to a friend. You know that you are just requesting for something at the portal, you Google a lot, you take hours to find the right item, and then your friend/colleague is just asking for your results. These results can now easily be shared with other people using the Identity Manager front end. There is now a form on the product level where you can just send that product as a recommendation to one of your teammates. The whole thing will then generate a deep link. You can see it down below in the slide, and you can then send that around if you like to. We talked about that scenario some time ago when I just was talking about what happens in the case of ineffective permissions. That means you are requesting for a specific permission, and that permission is only then an effective permission if an account is created in the same target system. If that account is not available, it is an ineffective permission. But what's to do now if you just request a specific entitlement and the system knows that this entitlement will not have any effect until you get your account? In this case, you can configure with the help of a configuration variable, you see that here, request missing accounts, an option that your web portal let you know that an account needs to be created as well, and just suggests to select that as an additional item. If you don't like that people gets aware of, then all works like before. That means you request for that permission, you might get it granted, but at the end it is an effective permission. For the SAP Compliance, just in detail, there is a complete new compliance configuration necessary and was implemented in Identity Manager 9.3. This was necessary because we are working closely together with a consulting company called IBS Schreiber, and these guys are very keen and very good in SAP detail compliance, that means in GRC. And just to allow to determine the complete arguments for SAP compliance, the complete rules, a new SAP detail management was implemented. What you see here is a typical function in SAP, and in the past of the old Identity Manager, it was only possible to use one function definition once. And depending on where that whole thing was standing in a list or in a tree, it was and or related and or connected. That was leading to a lot of very complex sub-functions and to problems at all. With the new model now, it is possible to use the same function definition more than once. And that means you can create sets. You can see that here in the picture, for example, there is the function definition as T-code, as you see it directly underneath of AAAB. And both of these S underscore T codes does have these TSC function definitions separate assigned. Again, this is only possible in the new Identity Manager. In the old world, it was only possible to have it once. However, the interesting feature here is now by being able to define different situations of permissions to name these situations, following the line of ST code, the first line, you see there is a name on the right-hand side called D-1. And the second one, again, ST code, that is then the second definition from the top, named as D2. And by having different situations configured in the editor and name them with a specific name, it is now possible easier to define conditions where these different situations gets compared. And it is possible to bring them in a logical relation with and or, like you see it in the sample, and it's much more flexible as everything we had before. Additionally to that, it is easier to understand and of course easier to maintain. And faster in the evaluation, of course.